Before the United States existed, before there was a flag or a constitution or a word for what this country would become, there was land. And someone owned it. Not in the loose frontier sense of a man staking a claim and hoping for the best, but legally. Formally, with deeds written in colonial courthouses, witnessed by magistrates, recorded in county ledgers that still exist today. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. That land passed through hands across generations, and with it passed the names of the families who held title to it. Those names are still out there. Some of them are sitting inside your own family tree right now, and you may have no idea that the surname you have carried your entire life appears in a colonial deed book dated a full century before the Revolution, describing a piece of ground that your ancestor owned in fee simple in a colony that had not yet decided to become a country. Think for a moment about what that actually means. Most people, when they picture their family's connection to early American history, picture arrival, a ship, a port, an ancestor stepping onto a dock with everything they owned in a single bag. That is where the story starts in the popular imagination. But for many American families, and possibly yours, the story does not stop at the dock. It keeps going. It moves inland. It moves into the court system. It moves into the land record. It plants itself in a deed so specific, so legally precise, that 300 years later, a researcher sitting in front of a digitized archive can read the exact acreage, the exact boundaries, the exact neighbors of the ground your family once stood on and called their own. And that is a very different kind of connection to American history from simply knowing an ancestor was here. It is documentary proof that a person sharing your name held legal title to a piece of this continent before the nation that now sits on top of it ever drew its first breath. The colonial land record is one of the most underused resources in American genealogical research. Not because it is inaccessible, though parts of it were difficult to access until recently, but because most people do not think to look there. They search for immigration records and census entries and church registers and military rolls. All of those are valuable, but the deed book is different. The deed book documents ownership. It documents what a family built and what they held and what they were willing to fight to defend. And in the colonies that became the United States, the period from the 1620s through the 1760s produced a land record so dense and so specific that for many surnames you can reconstruct a family's location and economic standing across 5 or 6 generations before the first shot was fired at Lexington. To understand what it meant to own land in colonial America, you have to understand what land was in the world these people came from. In England, where most of the original colonists trace their origins, land was not something ordinary people held title to. It was something inherited across centuries by a narrow class of families, something the average farmer could labor over for a lifetime and never possess. The yeoman farmer of 17th century England worked land he did not own, paid rent to a lord whose grandfather had held the same land before him, and understood that this arrangement was simply the structure of things. The tenancy was permanent. The boundary between working the land and owning it was not something most people expected to cross. That structure crossed the Atlantic with the colonists, but it did not survive the crossing unchanged. The colonial land system opened the door to property ownership for a class of people who had no access to it in the world they left behind. In Virginia, the headright system granted 50 acres for every person transported to the colony at a sponsor's expense, which meant that a man with means and connections could accumulate land through the act of paying for other people's passage. In Pennsylvania, William Penn sold land directly to buyers at prices deliberately set to be accessible to Quaker families of modest means. In New England, the town grant system assigned parcels collectively to settled communities, which then redistributed land to individual families according to a combination of need, social standing, and the practical requirements of building a functioning settlement from scratch. In the Carolinas, the lords proprietors offered land on terms designed to attract settlers from the other colonies and from England directly, with different arrangements for those who came with servants and those who came alone. The mechanics were different in every colony, but the logic was consistent. The land was there, it needed to be occupied and made productive, and the crown needed revenue and population and stability, and property ownership produced all three at once. What this created over the course of the 17th and early 18th centuries was a landowning class that thought about its situation in a way that had no real precedent in English history. These were not peasants. They were not landless laborers with nothing to lose. They were property owners who paid taxes, who served on juries, who held local offices, who sat in colonial assemblies and debated governance and rights and the limits of distant authority. When Parliament began pressing harder on the colonies in the 1760s, when the Stamp Act and the Townshend Acts and eventually the Intolerable Acts began to threaten the economic and political autonomy that colonial landowners had built across a century and a half, these men had specific and concrete reasons to resist. They owned something. It was recorded. It was legally theirs. And they were not willing to surrender its implications to a parliament 3,000 miles away, in which they had no voice and no seat. This is the frame inside which the colonial land record becomes a revolutionary document. The names on those deeds were not bystanders to what followed. In many cases, they were its architects, its financiers, its local organizers, its foot soldiers. When you trace a surname back to pre-revolutionary land ownership, you are not simply locating an ancestor who happened to be alive before 1776. You are finding someone who stood at the intersection of property and politics, at the precise moment when that intersection became the most consequential and dangerous place in the English-speaking world. The names most people associate with that moment are a handful of famous ones. Washington, Jefferson, Adams, Franklin, Hamilton. These names have been repeated so often in connection with the founding that they have taken on a quality almost like myth, as though the Revolution were something those particular men accomplished by themselves in a sealed room. But the colonial land record tells a different story. It shows a vast distributed population of property owners spread across every colony, in every county, at every level of wealth and social standing, who had equal and in many cases prior claim to the ground that became the United States. Their names are there, recorded in the deed books and the quit-rent rolls and the land grant patents, waiting for the people who now carry those names to come and find them. Take the name Pendleton. Edmund Pendleton of Virginia was born in 1721 in Caroline County, and spent his adult life in colonial law and politics. He owned land, he practiced law in the county courts. He served in the Virginia House of Burgesses for years before the Revolution began, and when the crisis came, he did not stand at a distance from it. He chaired the Committee of Safety. He presided over the Virginia Convention that debated independence. He helped draft the legal framework of the new state government, and later became the first judge of the Virginia Court of Appeals, where he served for more than 2 decades. His name appears in the Caroline County land records going back to well before the midpoint of the century, and the trail from those records forward through the war is short and well documented. The Pendleton name in families with Virginia roots is not common, and where it appears, the connection to that specific colonial landowning lineage is worth tracing. Or consider the name Laurens. Henry Laurens of South Carolina was a merchant and planter who held land in the Low Country, a man who had built his fortune through commerce and agriculture before the political crisis made everything he owned into a kind of wager on the outcome of the war. He served as president of the Continental Congress in 1777 and 1778. He was captured at sea by a British warship in 1780 while traveling to the Netherlands to negotiate a treaty, and he spent more than a year imprisoned in the Tower of London, becoming the only American ever held there as a prisoner of war. He was eventually exchanged for Lord Cornwallis himself, which gives some measure of how significant his captors considered him. The land records of Charleston and the surrounding parishes document the property his family held before the war, and the Laurens name in South Carolina families with colonial roots carries that specific history. The Middleton name is another that runs through the colonial land record of South Carolina, with a particular weight attached to it. Arthur Middleton signed the Declaration of Independence in 1776. His family had been accumulating land in the Carolina Low Country since the late 17th century. Middleton Place, the plantation that still stands outside Charleston, was laid out in 1735 and remains one of the earliest surviving examples of ornamental landscape gardening in the country. The family's holdings were substantial even by the standards of a colony where large landholding was common, and when Arthur Middleton put his name on that document in Philadelphia, he was placing everything those acres represented directly in the path of British retaliation. The British made certain of it. During the occupation of South Carolina, they burned the main house at Middleton Place and ravaged the grounds. The family rebuilt after the war. The land survived. The Middleton name and families tracing to colonial South Carolina carries a documented connection to one of the most significant landowning families in the history of the Revolution. The name Byrd runs through the Virginia land record in a way that makes it one of the most traceable property lineages in American genealogical history. William Byrd the first arrived in Virginia in the 1670s and began accumulating land in the Tidewater. His son, William Byrd II, expanded those holdings dramatically, acquired land along the James River and into the western backcountry, helped survey the boundary between Virginia and North Carolina in 1728, and left behind diaries that remain one of the most detailed personal records of colonial Virginia life ever written. The Byrd name does not appear on the Declaration of Independence, but it appears throughout the colonial land record of Virginia with a consistency and volume that makes genealogical research relatively straightforward. If Byrd is your surname and your family has Virginia roots, the path from the colonial deed book to your own tree is one of the more navigable ones you are likely to find. The Rutledge name from South Carolina carries weight in the colonial land record that the history books have not always captured clearly. Edward Rutledge was the youngest signer of the Declaration of Independence, 26 years old when he signed it in 1776, making a decision that could have cost him everything he and his family had built in the Low Country over multiple generations. His older brother John Rutledge served as governor of South Carolina during the war itself, continuing to govern after the British occupied Charleston, operating from the back country while the capital was in enemy hands. He later served as Chief Justice of the United States, a fact that receives far less attention than it should. Both men came from a family with land and legal standing in South Carolina going back to the early 18th century, and the Rutledge name in South Carolina families with colonial roots carries both of those threads through the deed record and the public record simultaneously. The name Pleasance is less well known than Pendleton or Middleton, but no less traceable through the Virginia colonial record. The Pleasance family were Quakers who settled in Henrico County, Virginia, in the late 17th century and accumulated substantial landholdings across the 18th century. Robert Pleasance, the most prominent member of the family in the Revolutionary era, was a planter and a committed abolitionist at a time when those two things existed in direct tension with each other in Virginia. He corresponded with John Wesley and Patrick Henry on the subject of slavery. He freed the enslaved people on his land after the Revolution, an act that few Virginia planters of his means were willing to take. His family's land is documented in the Henrico County records from the 1690s forward, and the Pleasance name in Virginia families carries that specific and layered history. The name Pinckney is one more that the colonial land record of South Carolina carries with a particular clarity. Charles Pinckney, father and son by the same name in succession, held land in the Low Country going back to the early 18th century. The younger Charles Pinckney was a delegate to the Constitutional Convention of 1787 and has been credited with contributing significantly to the language of the final document. His cousin, Charles Coatsworth Pinckney, also attended the convention and later ran for president twice. The Pinckney family's land in South Carolina is documented in the colonial plat books and the parish records going back to the early period of settlement, and the name in South Carolina families carries that specific dual thread of colonial land ownership and constitutional history. The name Tilghman belongs to a Maryland and Pennsylvania family whose land record begins in the mid-17th century. Richard Tilghman arrived in Maryland in the 1659 period and acquired land in Talbot County on the eastern shore. His descendants accumulated additional land across subsequent generations and spread into Pennsylvania and Delaware. Tench Tilghman, the most famous member of the family in the Revolutionary era, served as aide-de-camp to George Washington for nearly the entire duration of the war, and it was Tench Tilghman that Washington sent to carry the news of Cornwallis's surrender at Yorktown to the Continental Congress in Philadelphia in October of 1781. The ride to Philadelphia with that news, made at speed over several days, became one of the celebrated courier missions of the entire war. The land the Tilghman family held in Maryland is documented from the colonial period forward, and the name in mid-Atlantic families with colonial roots carries both the property record and that specific moment. The name Wentworth runs through the New Hampshire land record in a way that reflects the particular character of colonial governance in that province. Benning Wentworth served as governor of New Hampshire for more than 25 years, from 1741 to 1767, and during that time he issued hundreds of land grants across the province and into the territory that would eventually become Vermont. He was also, not incidentally, granting himself land out of those same grants, accumulating a personal holding that made him one of the largest landowners in New England. The Wentworth name in New England families carries that specific history of colonial land and power, and the grants issued during his tenure are documented in the New Hampshire State Archives. The name Schuyler belongs to the New York land record in a way that connects colonial Dutch land ownership to the Revolutionary War directly. The Schuyler family arrived in the Albany region in the mid-17th century as part of the Dutch colonial settlement of the Hudson Valley and accumulated large land holdings that persisted through the transition from Dutch to English rule. Philip Schuyler, the most prominent member of the family in the Revolutionary era, served as one of the 4 major generals appointed by the Continental Congress in 1775. His daughter Elizabeth married Alexander Hamilton. The Schuyler land patents in the Albany area are documented in the New York colonial land records going back to the Dutch period, and the name in New York families with colonial roots carries a property record that predates English rule. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. Not all pre-revolutionary landowners were wealthy. This needs to be said directly, because the tendency when thinking about colonial land ownership is to picture privilege on the scale of the Byrds or the Middletons, and that is not how the full record reads. The colonial court records of counties like Lancaster in Pennsylvania, or Spotsylvania in Virginia, or Essex in Massachusetts are full of men who owned 60 or 80 or 100 acres and were by any measure ordinary people. Farmers who got up before dawn and worked until dark and whose entire estate, when inventoried at death, consisted of a few iron tools, some livestock, a worn Bible, and the land itself. Tradesmen who had saved enough over 20 years of careful living to buy a modest parcel. Immigrants who arrived with almost nothing and built something small and theirs across a working life in a new country. These names do not appear in any published history of the era, but they are in the deed books, and the deed books have survived 300 years. The quit-rent rolls of colonial Virginia are among the most useful documents in American genealogical research for exactly this reason. A quit-rent was a small annual fee paid to the Crown in acknowledgement of royal authority over the land, and the rolls that recorded who paid it functioned year by year as a census of property owners. They name families, they specify acreage, they locate people in specific counties in specific decades, and that location is often the foothold that makes a larger reconstruction possible. If your family has Virginia roots and a surname that appears in colonial records, the quit-rent rolls are among the first places to look. Pennsylvania land records work differently but are no less valuable. The original warrants and surveys filed with the Land Office in Philadelphia beginning in the 1680s are still largely preserved. A warrant was the initial authorization to survey a parcel. A survey documented the actual dimensions and location of the land. A patent was the final document transferring legal title from the proprietor to the individual. That three-step process was recorded for every legal land transaction in colonial Pennsylvania, and the records contain the names of the first people to legally claim specific parcels across the colony. Names that appear in those records in the 1690s and 1700s can often be traced forward through successive generations of land transactions, wills, and tax assessments, all the way to the Revolutionary era and beyond. The Hollingsworth name runs through the early Pennsylvania and Delaware land records in a way that illustrates this clearly. Valentine Hollingsworth arrived in Pennsylvania with William Penn in the 1680s and received a land grant among the earliest issued in the new colony. His descendants spread across the mid-Atlantic and into the South over the following century, and the Hollingsworth name appears in land records from Pennsylvania to Maryland to Virginia to Georgia across the span of the 18th century. The original grant is documented. The subsequent transactions are recorded in successive deed books. If that name is yours, and your family traces to the Mid-Atlantic region, the documentary trail stretches back to within a few years of Penn's first landing on American soil. The Fithian name is less well known but similarly traceable. It appears in the Salem County, New Jersey land records of the early 18th century, carried by a Quaker farming family of modest means, whose most famous descendant, Philip Vickers Fithian, left behind a diary of his time as a tutor on a Northern Neck, Virginia plantation in 1773 and 1774. That diary is one of the sharpest and most detailed portraits of pre-revolutionary colonial society ever written. A young Princeton-educated New Jersey Quaker recording, with genuine curiosity, everything he observed about Virginia plantation life in the years just before the war broke open. The land record that produced his family is there in the Salem County records, and the name, rare as it is today, makes the genealogical trail shorter than most. In New England, the land record is organized differently from those of the mid-Atlantic and southern colonies. The town proprietor's records, which document the original distribution of land within each township, are often the earliest surviving evidence of a family's presence in a specific place. In towns like Dedham and Watertown and Northampton in Massachusetts, these records survive from the 1630s and 1640s. They contain the names of families who can be traced forward through colonial history across 4 and 5 generations, each generation working the land or adding to it or dividing it among children, until the Revolution arrived, and the men who held those deeds became the men who formed the local militia companies, sat on the committees of correspondence, and made the decision, sometimes in a matter of weeks, to commit everything they owned to a war whose outcome nobody could predict with confidence. The Winthrop name sits at the head of the Massachusetts land record in a way that reflects the political reality of early New England. John Winthrop, the first governor of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, held land from the very beginning of the settlement, and the Winthrop family's holdings in and around Boston were documented from the colony's first years. But below that famous name are hundreds of others that appear in no survey of the era, the names of farmers in Sudbury and Brookfield and Springfield who owned their land outright, who had cleared it from forest and built on it, and paid taxes on it, and willed it to their children. Those names are in the town records and the county deed books, and they have been there since before anyone in this country was called an American. The Custis name occupies a singular place in the Virginia land record. The family had been accumulating land on the eastern shore and in the tidewater since the late 17th century. When Daniel Parke Custis died in 1757 without a will, his widow Martha inherited a large estate, thousands of acres, a substantial amount of liquid wealth, and the legal complications that came with intestate succession in colonial Virginia. 2 years after his death, Martha Custis married George Washington. The Custis land did not simply sit alongside the Revolution. Through that marriage, it became part of the financial foundation of the man who commanded the Continental Army through 8 years of war. The Custis name today is rare, and where it appears in Virginia families with colonial roots, that specific history is traceable directly through the deed record. The records that document all of this are more accessible now than at any point since they were created. The Virginia Land Office records are available through the Library of Virginia's Digital Archive and include the original grants, surveys, and patents going back to the 1620s. The Pennsylvania State Archives holds the original Land Office warrants and surveys, with a significant portion digitized and searchable. The Massachusetts Archives contain the original town proprietors' records for dozens of towns across the colony. The South Carolina Department of Archives and History holds the colonial plat books going back to the 1670s. The Maryland State Archives has made its colonial land records available online. And the digitized colonial records available through Ancestry, Family Search, and Fold 3 allow you to search a surname against the land record of almost any county in the original 13 colonies without leaving the room you are sitting in right now. The approach that works is consistent regardless of which colony your family traces to. Start with what you already know: a county, a church record, a family tradition about where the first ancestor settled, a surname that keeps appearing in the same region across several generations. Take that starting point and move it backward through the deed books. The deed books of colonial counties were indexed by grantor and grantee, which means you can search for a surname and find every land transaction that name was party to across decades of colonial history. What you will find, when you do this, is not a single transaction but usually a chain of them. A family buying an original parcel, dividing it among sons in a will, selling a piece when money was short, acquiring neighboring land when an opportunity came. A patient, ordinary, generational process of building something on a piece of ground across time, one transaction at a time, one generation at a time, until the chain either ends in the Revolutionary era or passes through it and continues. And at the beginning of that chain, if you follow it far enough, you will find the original grant. The document that transferred the land from the crown or the proprietor to a private individual for the first time. That document names the person. It dates the transaction. It describes the land in terms of its physical location and its boundaries. And if the name on that document is the name you carry, you are holding something most people never find. Direct documentary evidence that your family was standing on American soil before the country existed, holding legal title to a piece of it, and tied by that legal fact to everything that came after. Not to one man or one famous moment, but to the whole long process by which 13 separate colonial societies decided over the course of a decade that they were something new. Go and look. The records are there. The deed books and the quit rent rolls and the grant patents and the land office warrants have been sitting in archives for 300 years, and an increasing number of them are now digitized and searchable from wherever you are. Find the county your family came from, search the name, follow the chain backward through the generations. What you are looking for is a document written in a colonial courthouse by a clerk whose name you will never know, recording the legal claim of a person who shares your surname to a piece of the continent that would one day become the United States. When you find it, read the description of the land itself. The meets and bounds surveying of the colonial era described property through the physical features on the ground: the creek it bordered, the oak tree that marked the corner, the ridge that formed the western line, the neighbor's fence it ran alongside. Many of those features are still there. The creek still runs. The ridge still rises. The ground is still the ground. And somewhere in the long chain of American history that connects that deed to the present moment is a family that carried a name forward across 300 years of change and loss and ordinary living and passed it all the way down to the person reading this right now. That name has been here longer than the country itself. It might be time to find out exactly how long. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.